Hi folks, I'm Tom Affolter, and this is Module 1 of 3, which will serve as a quick overview to Transact SQL, which is Microsoft's Enhanced SQL. To understand the material in these modules, I'll assume you already have an understanding of programming concepts, including variables and loops, conditional statements, as well as the ANSI SQL aspect, selects, joins, grouping, as well as the where and the order by statements within a select. If you don't have that kind of knowledge built in right now, or you don't recall it, I would suggest you go back and review before you proceed. In this module, we're going to focus on creating, executing, and editing stored procedures. I'll also cover parameters and how we can optionally pass information from a stored procedure, or rather to a stored procedure. First, a stored procedure is a quasi-program written in Transact SQL. I'm a little bit hesitant to call it a true programming language because it does not provide all those traditional input, output, and processing features we think of when we think of a programming language. Transact SQL never interacts directly with the client. In our world, it's always going to be a program that calls the Transact SQL. Technically, in a database management system, a stored procedure is a set of SQL statements with an assigned name that is stored in a database in a compiled form so it can be run or shared by programs and executed very quickly. Stored procedures offer a variety of benefits, of which speed and security are probably at the top of the list. Unless and even if you have a SSL encryption, a secure socket layer encryption, between your web server and your database server where the data is passed back and forth, a simple SQL select statement from the database server and the web server will divulge a lot of your structure information in your database. Remember that data moves back and forth in an XML format. And XML acts like a blueprint of your data. So therein lies the risk of having a SQL server connected to a web server via the internet rather than local. Hiding the structure of your select in a stored procedure is going to offer a lot of different benefits. First, select is first parsed, so a standard select statement that we might use is first parsed, then looks at make sure that the structure is correct. Once it determines that the structure is correct, it doesn't look at the columns, it then compiles, and only then will it execute in that SQL engine. A stored procedure, on the other hand, is parsed and compiled on the SQL server, kind of like an executable is in C# or VB, so that when you execute it, it doesn't have to go through that parsing and it doesn't have to go through that compilation. So it's going to execute much quicker. And also, no select is passed between the web server and database servers that divulge column names. In the stored procedure, all those are hidden because they're compiled. So you can write column aliases in a stored procedure and totally hide the table's original column structure. It's now recognized that most of the web pages that exist today should be completed by stored procedures, especially those e-commerce sites. Although I do understand that Microsoft's new entity framework controls offer some tight security as well. So we're going to focus again on Transact SQL. What we're going to cover in this class, even though it's going to be short, it's going to be an extremely employable skill and a valuable inclusion on your resume. So the basic command to create a stored procedure is create procedure, or we can use create proc, P-R-O-C, followed by the procedure name as the statements in the stored procedure follow. So in this example on the page, you're going to see that I simply have a create procedure, SP master as, and then underneath that I have a simple select statement. It's that select statement below that will be compiled, and when I execute SP master, then SP master will bring back the results of a select star from master. Let's give this a try. So I've logged into my SQL server, and at this point I'm going to go ahead and create a stored procedure. So let's jump over to baseball, and in baseball let me make sure that that's a selected table. It is. And I'm simply going to type in create procedure And I could just use simply proc as well. And I'm going to call it SP master as, and then underneath it I will give it the select statement that needs to be compiled. Select star from master. Okay. Now let's go ahead and parse it first. That makes sure that the format of the statement is correct. It doesn't verify that there's a master table here, and it doesn't verify column names. And I better spell procedure right because, well, if I don't, let's parse it. Procedures spelled wrong. Let's correct that. There we go. Now let's go ahead and reparse it again. Oh, says I'm not logged in. Hold just a second here. There we go. So now I just went ahead and I parsed it. It says that there's no errors. Now I'm going to execute it. Now notice when I execute it, nothing happened. And the reason that nothing happened is because I just created the store procedure. I never told it to execute. So if I want to execute this store procedure, there's a couple of ways that I can do that. Let's go ahead and delete this code out. And I can type in exec sp master. And it just says, ooh, not typing well today. And that just basically says go out there and run the store procedure sp master. If I execute it, you'll see that I get the data back. Now I can also exclude the exec. That's optional. And again, if I execute it, I get that same store procedure information back. And it's no different than I had written the select statement in. The difference that we find now with this is that it executes much quicker because I originally parsed it and it compiled, and now all it has to do is go through that execution mode. So as we just saw, once a store procedure has been built, we can execute it by entering the name of the store procedure in the query window and either pressing the exclamation mark, the run button up above, the execute button, or we can press the F5 on our keyboard. We can either enter in the exec in front of the store procedure for execute store procedure, or the shortcut is simply type in the procedure name and it would execute. Remember that a store procedure can have many chain commands. Sometimes those commands are independent of one another. Sometimes commands have to complete before the following command can occur, such as creating a table before you have to add data to it. What really happens in SQL Server is it executes a command typically and jumps into the next command, and if it can execute it, it's going to do them at the same time. So again, as I mentioned, occasionally you're going to want to make sure that the previous command executes before the following command can occur. If that's the case, then in the store procedure there is a directive. It's not a command, it's not part of Transact SQL, it's actually part of the DBMS or of the SQL Server itself. You can issue a command called go. And all go says is complete the statements previous before you can use the next command down below. Here's an example on this slide of go statements. So what we've got is we're creating a table called SPTest. In SPTest, the very first thing I do in the store procedure is we're creating a temporary table called myTable, and it looks like it's got two different columns in it, a member key column and a member name column, which really at this point are not significant to what I'm talking about, other than the fact that notice that as soon as that table is created, if I didn't have a go statement as I do in here, that create table may not have totally completed before it tried to insert records into my table, as you see in the second statement, the one just below the first go. So I have to make sure that that table first is created, so I'm going to issue a go above it. Then underneath that, I will insert the data. Now, of course, that inserting the data has to complete before I can go back in and list the data back out to my screen. So I issue a go statement after I insert the data, and the very last thing I do is I do a select star from that temporary table that was just created. And I should also point out that theoretically, a temporary table belongs only to the store procedure as it's executing. So once this select star from the temporary table, myTable, occurs and that store procedure ends, then that myTable, according to the book, is supposed to delete out of memory. But what I've discovered is there tends to be a sweeper program that is run periodically in SQL Server, and that store procedure is not, or in that case, that my table would not be deleted immediately. It might take a couple of moments or minutes for it to be deleted out, but I certainly wouldn't expect my table to still be in memory after the end of this store procedure. You should recall back from our CIS 126 ANSI SQL class that in order to create a view, you can use create view in the name of the view. Technically, if you want to go back in and modify the view, you could do an alter view command, but the fact is it's not an easy process to go through. The builders are much easier to use. So the same thing really occurs inside of a store procedure. Although there is an alter procedure command, it requires you basically to re-enter the entire contents of the store procedure. You cannot edit existing code by hand. You might as well retype the entire store procedure using that method. Calling it alter is really misleading because, again, you got to retype the whole thing in completely. I would never alter a table from the query window. In a moment, I'll show you how to use the quasi builder that's going to alter or edit the store procedure for you. It's not great, but it's certainly a lot better than having to go back in and retype the command by hand. Also, you cannot recreate a store procedure if it already exists. If you don't alter the store procedure, you have to delete it or drop it before you can recreate it. And again, I'll show you that in just a second. You can right-click on the store procedure in the table and select delete to remove it, or by hand you can issue a drop procedure and then enter the store procedure name, and that will drop it or delete it as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at some demos about how to create and alter stored procedures. So we're back to my SQL Server demonstration here, and previously we created a store procedure called SPMaster, and we went ahead and executed it, and we got this data down below. Now let's just go back in there and recreate that again. So I'm going to create proc SPMaster as select star from master again. And let me format it just a little bit better. And again, correct my spelling on it, and then let's go ahead and parse it. Tells me it's fine. Now let's execute it. Well, I can't execute it because it tells me that there's already an SPMaster that exists, so I have a couple of methods I can do to get rid of the original one. What I can do is I can type in drop procedure SPMaster, and that would allow me to delete out. I just give it the drop command, which is the same as the delete command within the query window. What I want to delete, it's a procedure, and the name of the procedure I want to delete. The other way that I could do it is let's go back in and take a look at the procedure as it exists. If I go back into my baseball 2014 table and I open up the tables, I open up programmability in here, you'll see there's an area in here for store procedures, and if I open that up, you're going to see all the past store procedures that I have created or played with, of which I best find SPMaster somewhere in here, and I don't see SPMaster in here, so I'm going to refresh it. You would expect an expensive program like SQL Server to do a refresh on its own, but it doesn't. And let's let it refresh. Should not take too long, and then there's my SPMaster in here. So the alternate way of deleting it would be just to highlight it, do a right click on it, come back down and issue a delete statement down here. Then what it's going to do is, which is a nice feature of SQL Server, is it's going to come back in and tell me if there are any dependencies, meaning do I have any other store procedures that are perhaps calling this store procedure? Are there any programs that if I delete this out I might cause problems? And right now I can click on show dependencies, and it tells me that the only object that's using this is the SPMaster itself, so I'm safe to delete that out. If I do a drop table, by the way, up above, I don't get this screen. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is show you an alternate way of creating that store procedure. We did it by hand, but I could also come back over here under my store procedures, do a right click, and tell it that I want to create a new store procedure. Now when I do that, it brings open a quasi builder, and when I say a quasi builder, what I really mean is it builds a basic structure for me and allows me to go back in and edit it. And one of the features that it has built in here, which is problematic, it doesn't work for everybody, is the ability to run a Control-Shift-M and have it fill in some of the information for you. So if I do a Control-Shift-M right now, it's not working on this particular computer. But if I come back up here to my query window, and inside my query window, let me look down through here and find out what I'm looking for in here. Specify values for template parameters. If I click that, it's going to open up the same window that on some computers Control-Shift-M works. It's going to open up this same window, and it's going to ask me some questions that will help me fill in this information a little bit quicker. I certainly can edit directly in this window, and I generally will do that on my own, but this is a nice feature. So I'm going to come back in here, and it wants to know who I am. I'll fill that in, the date that it was created. I'll come back in and put May 2015, a description, get all players for Seattle. What do I want to call it? I want to call it, and I see over here I've got the names of them, so I'm going to have to give it get, I'll call mine guest SEA players. Notice I put an SP at the front of this so that I know all my store procedures, and I can see somebody's played with this before, all my store procedures are always start with an SP. So in my code, and I see a SP, I know I'm referring to a store procedure. Now, the next thing down is it wants to know the parameters, and we're going to talk parameters in just a second, but for right now, let's go ahead and just delete this aspect out. We have no parameters that we're passing in, no values, so everything in here is going to be empty. No parameters at all. So when I'm done with it, I click OK, and it's going to change my background. And you'll see that it included all the information. It gave me the name. Now, it has a region for parameters. I have to delete that region out because it keeps that equal and that comma in. We'll take a look at that again in this same module in just a second. So I'm going to delete that information out entirely. Okay. And now I'm going to come back in here, and here is my basic selected it created. It's given me some optional information. It's really not necessary, but I can go ahead and leave it there. It won't hurt a thing. And all I want to do is say select all players from master. And I can't, obviously I said I wanted to get Seattle players. I can't get Seattle players in this case because why? Seattle players are in a different table. So we're going to reserve that, again, for a couple of slides later to go back and do that. But right now I don't have a join statement. I could be using a view for that matter inside it. In fact, I believe, let's take a look. I do have a view that does have my, I do not have a master. Well, I do have a master batting here. So let's do that. Let's pull it out of VW master batting. And VW master batting does have a field in there, I believe, called team ID, and we'll find out. So I want it where team ID equals SEA. Now, I should point out that if I parse this, and there is no team ID field out there, then parsing's not going to tell me that. Not until I compile it will it tell me that. So let's go ahead and parse it. It tells me that the parsing worked out fine. Now let's go ahead and execute it. And it says it executed fine. So in order to test it out now, what I need to do is simply go back in there and run sp get players. So remember, I can just simply highlight this guy, and only the highlighted statement will execute. And if I run this, now I think I'm getting back all the Seattle players. Let's take a look here. So where's my team ID? There it is. Team ID, all Seattle players from this particular view. So I'm using the editor out there. I don't need this information anymore. It's gone. Okay. And again, as I did before, I can simply go back in and type in the name of the store procedure to get to it. Let me come back here real quickly and double check here. So the name of my store procedure, I undid it, was sp get Seattle players. Let's close that out. Don't want to save that part of it. And let's look over here, refresh my store procedures. And there are my SP get Seattle players. Now let's say for the sake of argument we decide that we needed to go back in there and we wanted only the Seattle players for this respective year. So I'd have to go back in and edit it. If I wanted to, I could come back in here and type in alter stored procedure SP get Seattle players, but if I did that, in essence, I would have to type out the entire statement from scratch, and that is pretty useless. That makes that alter stored procedure statement relatively useless to us. We might as well drop the table and recreate it for that, the stored procedure and recreate it for that matter. But there is an alternate way of doing it much easier. If I come back over to my stored procedure and I right-click on it and I click Modify, what it will do is it will take that stored procedure code, recreate it for me, and let's take a look here. Hello. There we go. And it brings it back, but this time, instead of being a create procedure, it's now an alter procedure statement. And I can change this statement if I wanted to and say, and year ID equals, and we're dealing with what, 20, let's do 2010. And I believe that statement is correct, but let's try this. Let's highlight it first. Let's execute it to make sure it's going to work, and it did. And so we wanted only the year 2010 out of it. So now I'm going to execute it. It alters the table. Okay. Now I can delete this out, and I can type in SP, what is it, get SEA players, and now I've got that stored procedure saved, and I've only got Seattle and 2010 players in here. So the alter table command that you would put in to a stored procedure, or excuse me, into a query window doesn't work. It does work, but it's a pain. I would never dream of doing that. You know, your best bet is to simply come back over here, right-click, and modify. And when you modify, you can edit that stored procedure out as such. Okay? So hopefully that one made sense. Let's continue on. Just as with C# methods or VB functions, Transact SQL offers the ability to pass data or parameters to a stored procedure. Parameters can also be called arguments in some languages. Parameters and later variables will be identified within a stored procedure with an @ symbol prefix. Looking at the example that we have here, I have create procedure SP myproc, and what I've done underneath it is I've identified a parameter that will be passed in, and this is a required parameter. It will have to be passed in. When the data is passed in, it's going to be referred to as &myparam, and it's expecting to receive in varchar type data or string type data. When we pass that string data in, by the way, when we call the stored procedure, it will have to have apostrophes around it, not quotation marks. When you pass a parameter, it has the same scope as a variable, which we're going to discuss later. In a select example, you'll see that the @city parameter placeholder, that @city parameter placeholder will be replaced in the statement with the parameter that's passed in. Notice how I don't have to worry about the quotation marks around the data. The stored procedure is executed with the name of the stored procedure followed by the parameters, and again, as I mentioned, the EXEC is an option. So as I just mentioned, when you declare a parameter, as I have in this example, @myparam varchar 10, I'm telling it that the stored procedure has a parameter, and that parameter must be filled in. If you don't fill that parameter in, you're going to get an error. The example of how you might fill it in is on the screen here, where I would pass in SP myproc, and you'll notice that the data has a apostrophes around it. Why? Because it's varchar type data, and we have to pass it in with the apostrophes around it. You can default a parameter, and you can make it optional if you choose. In this particular example, I've got the same procedure we created on the previous slide, but at this point I've gone back in and I've added in an equal data, and of course the data will be whatever data you want. That's just a word I threw in there. But in this particular case, if you do not pass in a parameter to the store procedure, then the store procedure will default to data in this case. So we're going to go through and try a couple of things here. The first thing we're going to do is go back in and recreate that first store procedure we did, where we're going to pull out Babe Ruth using just a standard select statement. The next thing that we're going to do is modify that store procedure, and we're going to allow for a parameter to be passed in. And the parameter we'll call it is @playerName. We're going to allow 30 characters as a varchar type data. And then I'm going to expect that whatever player name is passed in this particular case, it is required. It will pass it down to that @player name that's in the select statement. So as soon as we're done with that, we'll execute it out, and we'll find that we should be able to make this a reusable store procedure. Let's play with this first, and then we'll come back in and take a look at some default data. So we're back to our Management Studio and the demonstration that we had previously been working on. And now I'm going to go ahead and create a new store procedure. And I'm going to call this one Get Player. And first of all, I see I've already got a Get Player here. So let's go ahead and let's delete this guy out. And I wish it would speed up. And let's go ahead and delete it. He's gone. Okay, and I'm going to get rid of this code. Now this is a very simple store procedure. I could go ahead, do a right click and create it, but it's going to be, in this case, quicker to do it by hand. Not to edit it, but to create it initially. So create proc sp get player, and then I want to create it as select star from master. I got to make sure I got baseball selected. I do. Where name last equals Ruth. Okay, and let's go ahead and check this guy. He says he completed successfully, and now let's go ahead and execute him. And it wrote. So now let's see if I get Babe Ruth back when I execute sp get player. I would actually get all names that have a last name of Ruth, but just as it happens, Babe Ruth happens to be the only player that's played with the last name of Ruth. So now what I'd like to do is, it works well, but I want to go ahead now and I want to modify this store procedure to allow me to have parameters in it. So what I could do is I could come back here to an alternate, which in this case, one of the few times it might be easier, but I think I'm going to go ahead and delete this out here. Let's go back in, let's refresh my store procedure, and we've got sp get player. Let's modify it. So there is the modified version of it. Okay. Now what I want to do is I'm going to add in a parameter. So in order to put a parameter, I'm going to put it right here at the bottom. I can put it in parentheses. Those are optional. I normally use them. So let's do an @, and we're going to call it player name. And I'm going to allow varchar on here, as we did in the example. Varchar, and let's make it up to 30. Okay? So now I've got this player name. This is how hard it is. I'm going to take that player name, and I want to be a replaceable parameter. I'm going to copy that guy, and I'm simply going to come back down here. I'm going to paste in the parameter. So the parameter will be passed in as, in varchar, let's try that, will be passed in as perhaps Ruth. Ruth will become @player name, and it will fill in Ruth right here. I will not have to put apostrophes around it because the fact that I'm making it varchar will take care of that for me. So let's make sure everything works out correct. Let's parse it. It says it worked okay, and now let's execute it. And it says everything worked fine. So now what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and execute the store procedure. Let me jump to a new query window. So I got sp get player. and I'm going to do Control V here. Now when I pass the parameter in, that's when I have to put the apostrophes in it. So if I want to look for everybody who's had the last name Boone, for example, okay, SP get player Boone, let's execute it. And there we go. So you'll see that there's a variety of different players that had the last name Boone. Let's try how many players might have had the last name Jones. And execute it. Holy cow, it's going to take, why is it taking a long time? A lot of Joneses have played. Those are all the Joneses that have played. So again, we could have also, I want to point out, put the EXCC in front of this. Again, it's optional, but it's still going to do exactly the same thing. Okay, so we've got our basics down. We know how to create the basic store procedure, we know how to edit it, and we know how to pass in parameters. So I'm going to give you a couple of challenges here, and what I'll do is I'll read a problem out to you. I'd like you to go ahead, pause the slides, see if you can solve it on your own, and then right afterwards I'm going to come back in and I will solve it myself. So the first problem says, let's generate a store procedure that returns players' names in the format first name, last name, as in John Doe. Select a player's data by state by passing in a state. So I want to make sure that if I pass in Washington, I only want to have Washington players listed. Data should be in last name, then first name order, and then they tell me here to call the store procedure SP players by state. So let's go ahead and see if we can create this one. Go ahead and pause the slide for just a moment, see if you can do it, and in a moment I'll continue on and create it for you. Okay, folks, what I'd like to do is go ahead and generate that last store procedure. So the first thing that I'm asked to do is to go ahead and create a store procedure that returns the names back in a first name, last name format. So before I create the store procedure, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I know that's going to come out of master. So let's go ahead and make master visible over here. I'm going to go back to my tables. There's my master table and my columns. Here we go. So I see that I have name first and name last. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select name first plus a space plus name last from master. And let's go ahead and just execute that and see if the data comes out correctly. So I'm getting my first name and last name. I don't have a column header, so let's go ahead and give that a column header of name. And let's re-execute it again. And there we go. So far so good. Now what I want to do is to be able to pass in a parameter and only get a particular state, such as the state of Washington. So let's go ahead and put a where clause on this. And I'm going to say where state equals Washington, just to prove it, and it's not state, it would be, and it didn't specify players' names in the format John Doe by state, so let's assume that by state meant birth state. So let's go ahead and say where birth state equals Washington. And let's execute it. And everything seems to be coming out okay, and I'm assuming that that is only the Washington players. So let's turn that into a store procedure now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to type in create proc, and the name of the proc was SP players by state. Okay. Now underneath here I'm going to need to create a parameter that I'm going to pass into it. I could create it right now, and if I executed it right now I have to put an as statement in here. If I executed it now I would get all Washington players forever. It would not be reusable. So I'm going to come back right below my let's correct this right here while I'm at it. Players by state. And I'm going to create my parameter. And inside my parameter, I'm just simply going to call it my at state parameter. So I've got at state and I need to give it what the data type is going to be. In this particular case, we're passing in 2-digit characters, so I'm going to make it a varchar 2. Now, I've got this state parameter created. Let's replace this with a state parameter. So let's grab this guy, copy him, paste him over here. And I think we're in pretty good shape here. I think I got an extra parenthesis up here, though, it looks like. Let's see, do they balance? Those balance, and those balance. I think I'm in good shape. Let's parse it. It says it's in good shape. And now let's go ahead and let's execute it. Said it worked. So let's find out if it worked. I'm going to go ahead down just below my store procedure. Copy this out. Paste it down here, and I'm going to pass in Washington, and let's execute it. Hopefully that's Washington players. I got George Abrams first. Let's look for California players. And it seems to be working just fine. So now let's go to our next problem. Give me a moment. Let me get that set up. So our next problem says, generate a store procedure that returns players' names and weight greater than or equal to a passed-in weight parameter. So again, I'm assuming if I pass in 150 pounds, I want every player who weighed more than 150 pounds to be displayed. We'll just modify that existing store procedure that we have right now in order to come up with this one. So let me jump back over to that, and let's go ahead and create a new store procedure. I'm going to do by weight. Let's see if I've already got one over here created. So I need to drop in advance. So get player by weight. I want that name. I'm going to copy that name out, but I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy so I can recreate him again. Come on. Okay. So now, the name of that procedure I'm creating is called Get Player's Weight. This time I'm going to pass in a weight. Okay. And if I look over at my data type for weight inside my master table, I see weight is a small int. So let's go ahead and make it a small int. Okay. Now I want to pull the first name and the last name just like I did, and let's go ahead and include the weight as well. Okay. Let's format this a little better. From master. Now what I want to do is I want to pull everybody's weight where the person's weight is greater than the passed in weight. Now notice they're very similar, but they're separate. So I've got where weight equals at weight here. Now I don't want it equal, I want it greater than, I believe, or equal to. And let me get rid of this guy down below here. So let's see what we got here. Create procedure, SP players, weight. I pass in weight, it's a small int, as, select the first name, the last name, including the weight, from master where weight is greater than the height. Let's go ahead and, as long as we're doing this, let's just order it by weight anyway, even though I didn't ask for it in the example. Okay. And let's check this to see if it's going to work. It says it's going to work. Okay. Let's go ahead and execute it. It says it wrote it, so let's go down below here and let's run one. So I want all the players to have a weight of greater than, let's do 200. Now notice I'm not putting apostrophes around the 200. Why? Because that's a numeric value and there's no apostrophes that go around it. So let's execute that guy and see how he looks. There we go. All the players that in order that were greater than 200 pounds. Let's find all those players that are greater than 250. Shouldn't be too many players, I would think. Execute. And here's all the players that we have. It tells me over here in the bottom right-hand corner there's 108 players that were 250 pounds of weight or greater. And you know, Did I make a mistake here? It looks like it ran twice. Let me try that again. I think I ran that statement twice. Yep, there we go. There it is. So let's jump back over to the next challenge. So the next one says, generate a store procedure that returns the players' names and weight greater than or equal to a passed-in weight parameter. Ah, that's the one we just did. Let's try the next one. Modify the previous problem to allow for two parameters, minimum weight and maximum weight. Default minimum to 0 and the maximum to 1,000. So what it's telling me is it wants me to go ahead and pass in a parameter, minimum weight, maximum weight, and we want all the players that are in between those two weights that exist. So I'll probably have to come back to the slide and reference it again here. So let's jump back over to SQL Server, Management Studio, and let's go ahead and, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and alter this table because we're going to use the same one here. And in this case, I'm going to have, I'll have a minimum weight, and I will also pass in a maximum weight. We'll call that max. Okay. So now we want to default these as well so that we don't have to have any parameters put in. So let's default the minimum, as it said, to 0, and the maximum weight, we're going to default that to 1,000 pounds. That's pretty big. So 1,000 pounds here as select first name and last name. Let's see what we got here. So now we have to change our weight. We want our weight to be greater than or equal to the minimum weight, and we want the weight to be greater than, you see, I have greater than the minimum, and I want it to be less than or equal to the maximum weight. And we're still going to order by weight. That should work. So again, notice what happened. It's looking for two parameters, but it's telling me that I don't have to pass them in. I did an alter table only because I already had the select statement on the screen. Otherwise, it would have been much easier to simply go back in and do a right click on that SP get players weight underneath the store procedure, right click and modify it. So let's check this guy out to make sure he's going to work. Says he's in good shape. Let's execute him. Says he worked, so let's run it. So if this guy works correctly, if I do a Control V here and I don't put any parameters after it, it should give me every player, because I don't believe there's any players less than 0 pounds or no players greater than 1,000. And there we go. We get every player back. But now if I want the players that weigh between 150 and 200 pounds, now I can run it this way. And now I'm only going to get between 150 and the 200 pounds. So again, having parameters, as we've taken a look at here, and this is the last part of this first module, is pretty simple. You can play around with it a little bit. I suggest that you challenge yourself a little bit with some different store procedures, and I certainly will challenge you in an exercise here shortly.